Executive of the law school of the University of Exeter, and we've had lots of different relationships over the last 20 years or so. We've had also joint projects, but since the pandemic, we had a little bit less of an interaction with the law school, so it is wonderful that Andrea Wallace, who's associate professor at the law school, has accepted to come and present. Particularly important because as she's associate professor of law and technology, and a lot of her work has been in thinking about the sharing of data, in particular biological data, as part of the work on cultural heritage in a broader sense. In fact, her work is really central to a lot of the things that we are working on here, both on the Biology and Environments Fund and also on the Data and AI kind of strands. And so I'm sure there's going to be huge amounts of overlap in the kind of things that we've been looking at and the kind of things that we're considering in our work. And so without further ado, very much again, thanks for accepting to give the seminar, and we look forward to your talk.
Thank you. So super excited to talk about the life sciences because I need to get out of art, but I'm also going to give you a little bit of a, well, you'll see, a lot of my examples are going to be based in art, and that's for a lot of reasons related to the underlying issues that we're going to be talking about that kind of exist in surface when we think about making collections available, open access, and where we see actual harm start to materialize. Okay, so my research specifically, it looks at how cultural institutions digitize their collections, but I would use that really broadly. So organizations, collection holders, community archives, things like this. But also, when we think about digitization, it's not just taking one object and converting it to a digital form. There's actually a lot of biases that get imprinted on the output in the process. And so really starting to peel back and problematize the process of digitization so that we start to think about the end results and the types of data that we publish in the end being more representative, being less harmful, those sorts of things. So a little bit of an overview. So I'm going to talk a bit about IP, mostly copyright. I'm not going to assume that anyone in here is coming with their copyright book in their bag. And one of the reasons is because copyright is so expansive in what it can or can't protect. And so while we do think about patents or even design rights or other types of IP, copyright is usually the very blunt tool that gets used to protect against things when we think about what it is that we want to do or not with our data. Then, of course, openness. So I collect a lot of empirical data. I'm going to talk to you about the usefulness of it, but within this kind of open GLAM movement, which stands for galleries, libraries, archives, and museums. And again, it's not just these organizations. It's sometimes government archives, it's community archives, it's anyone who's publishing materials under an open license. And then some of the trends that we see kind of happening from global open GLAM activity. So where we were 10 years ago is a lot different from where we are today, partly because 10 years ago, people were still trying to convince their decision makers, like, we should stop claiming copyright into stuff. No one's really making money off of it. So like, why are we doing it, right? We gotta hire a bunch of people to run a licensing service. They gotta respond to emails to people who ask for using something. You're like, how much? No, bye, thank you, right? And then we start to see a lot of inequities and who that impacts. Career advancement, specific professions that need access to data or images or specimen or these sorts of things in order to write and publish, blah, blah, blah. So open GLAM over the past 10 years really started from a, well, let's claim copyright, but apply an open license so people can use it without permission, to now, let's publish it all public domain as a matter of policy. And there's been a lot of risks that have been taken in the process that were really important risks by institutions that now, again, we're starting to see some trends and challenges emerge because of some of those questions that didn't surface in what it was that we were publishing and why. So I'm going to make all this a little bit less concrete, or sorry, abstract, more concrete, by trying to kind of give you a bit, you can't see that, can you? Yeah, you can. A bit of an anchor. So maybe you saw this, maybe you didn't. IP law professors around the world are freaking out. In Colorado, somebody essentially used Midjourney to generate some images. Of course, wrote some prompts, inserted it into the box, and dozens, maybe hundreds of images came out. Of course, the prompts were things that were specifically designed by the person who inserted them. From those images, they selected maybe 2 or 3, upscaled them using Stable Diffusion, and then entered them in an art context for the digital arts and digital manipulated photography category, okay? He won. And even in the description said, I used Midjourney to create these images. So I'm not know, how much more transparent he could have been. But after winning, of course, like it broke the internet, everyone said, oh my God, was it art or not? Did he cheat? Is the image protected by copyright in itself? If so, who owns it? All of these questions. But to me, I don't even care about the copyright question here, because every time new technologies emerge, we start to think like, what is it that's different? Really, is there anything? But what I think is really interesting about this moment is that the tech is helping us think more critically about the data that we're publishing because of the way that it surfaces biases. So to give you, there we go. To give you an example, what we just saw, which of course is down here, is a lot of imagery and iconography that looks really familiar. Okay, so these text to image phrases that were used, we don't know, but from the name of the work, to what it recalls, we see a lot of iconography related to Orientalism. And of course, in early modern France, artists used both real and imaginary intricate details to create this world of foreignness and otherness, in which they evoked and mixed different styles of art and architecture from Turkey, Egypt, India, Algeria, and all kinds of other regions without actually thinking about where it came from. So, this really popular aesthetic then became a method of dissemination about these cultures, and of course was controlled by a Western male population, which Edward Said described as the limitations that follow upon disregarding, essentializing, denuding the humanity of another culture, people, or geographical region. So when we think about the outputs of this Midjourney piece compared to some of the things that we're seeing generative AI resurface, it's really recombining these types of meanings without the important context that we all know needs to be there. And so one of the reasons that this then becomes important is because all of these works, these images of these paintings are in the public domain. So there is nothing in theory protecting these images from being put into data sets, right? To take a photograph of a painting that's in the public domain is not a new work. There's nothing sufficiently original about that. Whether or not institutions accept that as part of their policies, I'm going to show you some data on in a minute. But these sorts of images then get combined in these huge data sets, right? And it's not just these, it's all of the images that are in institutions' collections that are marked as public domain. So, very, very brief intro to IP with a bit of a focus on copyright. So, we're using the straight out of the Wikipedia article on copyright, which you'll notice has an open license, CC by SA. Talk about that in a minute. But copyright itself is something that arises automatically as soon as an idea is expressed in an original way. And that understanding of originality is very, very, very low. But you still have to have some sort of creative input that results in that work being the author's own intellectual creation. So of course, we've got text, we've got visual works, sound recordings, data, database content, computer programs, all sorts of things. It lasts for the author's lifetime. We call that the author or the creator. And then 70 years after their death. And during that time, the rights holder has an exclusive monopoly and can charge people or prohibit them from using the work without permission. So one of the ways that we see IPs switch dramatically is when we look at patents. So instead of originality, we have novelty, right? There's a public disclosure element. You get your patent granted, you need 20 years of monopoly to kind of commercialize that, at which point it passes into the public domain. So this is a lot longer when we think about the lifetime plus 70 years, which also has an impact on the type of stuff that we see enter the public domain and at different times. So where did it come from? Well, right here in the UK, So originally it kind of stemmed from the privilege system that really developed in Italy, where people saw this way of investing and making sure that people and their investments were protected by setting up a print house or something. Okay, so you're gonna have a monopoly. We're gonna grant you a privilege over that specific thing because it's useful for society. Now that you have that monopoly, we know that you're gonna recur whatever you've invested into it and then some. And to do that is important because we want people to have different things. As you might imagine, lots of corruption comes from those sorts of systems. It even happened here in the UK, which is where we start to see the Patents Act and copyright statutes emerge. But the idea is that if we give people, a reward for what they've created, then they will be able to be incentivized to create new things. And the more better creative things that we have, the more things we all have as a society to learn from, to reuse. So there's an incentive theory that's kind of baked into it. But it also, of course, today is very heavily influenced by economic market incentives, right? What about just giving something away to the world? That's an incentive. A reward is that everyone knows that you've done it, right? All the goodwill. But we still see a lot of market logic enter this when we think about what those incentives are. And yeah, you'll probably be very interested to know that ChatGPT was not too bad when I asked, what is copyright and where does it come from? So again, we see ChatGPT and lots of other kind of open AI frameworks using Wikipedia because CC BY gets say, right? All of the things that we know are openly licensed for reuse start to reappear because it's available. Okay, so what is the public domain? Well, again, the idea is that everything by default is in the public domain. You have to do something in order to be rewarded with a monopoly. But there's also some things that have been carved out that cannot be protected as a matter of law. So non-original works, and here we start to see some kind of biases enter the space when we think about intangible cultural heritage, traditional knowledge and cultural expressions. These are things that IP has said, they don't fit here, they don't fit in our framework. We're going to create a different one specifically about traditional knowledge and cultural expressions and a different system for that because they're not original, right? Then we have functional works, can't protect those, results of natural processes, life sciences, these sorts of things. But we also have short phrases, facts, numbers, descriptive metadata, paradata, and then materials that predate IP laws, okay? We then have materials for which IP rights have expired. So yes, they were protected, but that right has expired since then. And then we have materials that get dedicated to the public domain by their creator or inventor. And I'll talk about CC0 on the next slide. But when we start to then think about what's available to be reused, that public domain represents a very certain type of demographic and type of materials that are available for reuse. So this is where open movements, licenses, and tools come in. Because some of these rights are so long, open licenses are a way for you to grant upfront permissions to people who find your stuff. So they don't have to contact you, they don't have to ask, and the terms of the license tell them exactly how they can use it. But when we think about open and what that means, all of the scholarly publishing and the different kind of associations say that materials have to be available to be reused for commercial purposes and modification. So any license that says, oh, you can't use this for commercial purposes is not an open license. So what we see is that these Creative Commons licenses, which have been around for many years now, are really being taken up and used even by, UK higher education. When we think about CC by SA, which means we'll cite you and we have to share this content under the same license, so that's share alike, or BY is for attribution. We then have a couple of tools, so they're not necessarily licenses because you have to have rights in something to apply a license. So the public domain dedication and also the public domain mark. And these are really popular because not only are they widely recognized, but they're available in many languages. They're interoperable in terms of law. So when you think about someone in the UK who publishes something and someone in Zimbabwe finds it, there will be very different copyright rules that potentially apply depending on who the user is. But the person can trust the license that's here and say, oh, it's CC BY, the code and the terms of this license apply, and so now I know I'm protected in my own jurisdiction. Okay, so openness, of course, this is what has disrupted everything, and here's where we get into the juicy data. So, got a survey that we are currently working on converting to a real website because it's like out of control at this point. But it's essentially with a colleague, Douglas McCarthy, we just started tracking what institutions were publishing their materials and created this spreadsheet, which has grown over the years. We now have 1,669 GLAMs, right? From 55 countries, there's 95 million, we call them digital surrogates, they're essentially digital reproductions of collections materials across every sort of category you can imagine. Okay, so some are paintings, some are images of specimens, some are scans of designs, it's all over the place. And we only put something into the database if they're releasing their images, and then other stuff, great. Data sets, all of that too. But the images is the entry point, because that usually helps you track a specific policy that's happening within an institution level, as opposed to something that got funded and by obligation, people had to publish a data set, you know, under a specific license, that sort of thing. But what this means is that, you know, when we look at the cultural institutions globally, there's less than 1% of institutions globally who are participating in Open GLAM. And I'm going to show you a little bit more of this data. So, interesting representation. So, 88% of these are in the US, well, I would say Europe, not just the EU, and the UK, which is for a few reasons. So we have representation in areas where we see a data aggregator, because that helps us locate institutions that are publishing data. So Japan, Australia, New Zealand, there's also one in Uruguay. And then also, of course, where we see like a lot of activity because maybe there's well-resourced institutions or institutions that have really kind of started asking some of these questions in a way that pushed other people to do it as well. But it accounts for 86 million, or almost 90% of the digital assets that have been published. So these countries are also countries, of course, with histories of colonization and imperialism. So what we're seeing is that, you know, both in terms of like physical assets and digital assets and wealth, we have a global minority that is holding and producing knowledge about the rest of the world, even presenting themselves as universal institutions who are well equipped to do these things. But what also happens is that we then see data structures, data themselves in English, right? The types of research or the ways in which you can access and produce additional knowledge around this also then are limited in terms of the policy and what the institution has digitized. So this is, of course, a small graph, but it kind of shows you country by country representation in terms of how many institutions within these countries have been participating. But something else that we track is how the institution approaches it themselves. So some of them say, okay, we're going to adopt this as a matter of policy. When the rights expire in something and we digitize it, we're going to publish it to the public domain. So that is all of the eligible data, we just get it out there. Some eligible data is where we see institutions go, I'm just going to start with a small collection, or we got a grant and the obligations of that grant are that we have to publish things under an open license. So we see a lot more institutions taking this approach. But again, it then becomes interesting when you look at the individual contributions of these institutions as well. So if this is, you know, the whole world, and this is the UK, the UK is about 6.2%. So we've got 98 institutions who largely publish just some of their data to the public domain. The rest of them, actually, they're not even publishing in a public domain. They claim rights in it and then publish it under an open license. We only have 7 institutions that, as a matter of policy, have said we're no longer going to claim rights in our collections after we digitize them if the collections are in the public domain, and then a few that are kind of dipping their toes in. But what also is really interesting when you start to track some of this is where you see national laws creating more consistency than others. So there has been actually some correlation in terms of institutions going, okay, we really don't have a leg to stand on when we claim copyright because there's more case law or legislation that pushes them away from doing this, as opposed to in the UK, we just literally in January had a case come out that has really discouraged people from doing this. Or in some other countries where there's a very strong approach to how we recognize rights and what that means in terms of digitization and everything else. And then, you know, this is just the other way of presenting it. If we were going to compare kind of the spread of these, we then start to see some really interesting comparisons because in theory, and there has been an implementation of a law in the EU that says you cannot claim rights in your reproduction media when the work itself is in the public domain. But we see a lot of institutions taking different approaches when in theory, it should be pretty harmonized, right? And then lastly, because this is always really fun, when we look at the kind of the distribution according to assets, you know, 95 million, 84 million are here. When we look at the UK's percentage, most of them, of course, people claim copyright in and then publish under an open license. The Natural History Museum, whoa, that's like 90%. Which is actually fabulous because a lot of the stuff that they apply a license to, and this is very meta, is when you look at the leaves, which are on a paper and it's kind of an archival mount with like the image around that, there can be a copyright argument that that is a creative arrangement of those specimens. So the photograph itself may have a copyright, as opposed to the British Library, right, where they're taking photographs or scans of prints, of print media, and things that we then see that be interpreted differently. But it becomes very interesting when you look at the breakdown and who's contributing to the public domain. Lastly, some other really interesting trends that we see are across the platforms where things are published. So what's helpful about many of these platforms like Europeana is they have built into the tech infrastructure the actual licenses and guidance around them. So people understand it better, they know what they should be applying, and the license is attached to the content that they apply, as opposed to Wikimedia Commons, where it has to be openly licensed, CC by SA, or more permissive, as opposed to Flickr Commons. Flickr Commons started 10 years ago when people were a little freaked out, but like interested in publishing things that they thought there was no copyright in. But they didn't want to say there's no copyright in this because no one had really ever done it before. So they used a term called no known copyright restrictions, which is essentially a disclaimer, right? It's not a legal statement, go use this. Just means like, well, we don't think there's anything wrong with it, go. But here's where we start to see some really interesting questions emerge. So this is the digital single market provision that says when the term of protection has expired, anything produced during an act of reproduction should not be subjected to a new copyright, okay? Now, works of visual art. If you're a lawyer, the first thing you go is, but what's a work of visual art? Is it an apron? No, historically, this is craft, right? Don't have to release that. What about antiquities, ethnographic materials? Why isn't this a sculpture, right? So we start to see these cataloging biases appear in the customary meanings of these things, while at the same time, histories of collecting, the ways in which we have even expanded collections based on like one individual's curiosity cabinet that then became a big thing that was definitely financed by sugar plantains in Jamaica as a man ran around the world and collected whatever he wanted and then bequeathed it to the UK government. And this is where we get the British Museum, right? These are the things that happen. So of course, when we look at the National Gallery, out of their 2,300 plus paintings, there are 21 that are painted by women. So we also have a lot of bias in collections that when we know there's no copyright in the reproductions and those things get published, those biases then become hyper biases in the digital images. because of those histories of collecting and what has been in institutions. Which, you know, isn't anything new, right? We're looking at guerrilla girls, we're looking at the ways in which people who have been othered have been represented within institutions or on walls. And all of those things also materialize in catalog data and how we see this materialize on the front end. So what we know now is that actually copyright compliance, right? To not claim a copyright in something is actually complying with copyright law. Copyright compliance is a policy decision. So if we look at all of those institutions that I flagged at the beginning, there's around 170 that comply with copyright law and say, as a matter of policy, we're not claiming new rights when we digitize. The rest of them either claim new rights or they only publish things here and there under a public domain tool. So the overwhelming majority still claim rights in their digital collections. Which means this default approach and all the things that are kind of baked into intellectual property, right? Economic markets, who has access, propertizing and excluding, also is kind of influencing the specific types of harms that we see arise. And so, of course, we've got public domain, but we've also got these things called open compliant, where institutions are saying CC BY or CC BY SA, and then the copyright disclaimer, which is like no copyright restrictions. Okay. What next? Well, I actually don't really know. I'm just gonna use this as an opportunity for us to maybe talk a little bit about some of the trends. The plenty of like biases in these data sets that we're seeing resurface in AI and machine learning, but there's been some really important movements around Indigenous rights and data sovereignty, and also this area that we're seeing developing, which I do a lot of work in, and it's digital and intellectual property restitutions. I'm gonna kind of walk through these. So collections as bias, right? When we think about even the archive or the institution or data sets, right, specimens, kind of the extractive practices, the way that we structure them and then publish them has a lot of bias built into it. So these like legacies of colonialism are something that a lot of people have been interrogating. Oh, that's okay, I thought I hung up on our friends. A lot of people have been interrogating and really pushing us to think about even when it is that we're adding things to collections. How are we restructuring the data? How are we looking at also innovative and critical ways to use the data as it exists to reveal what some of these institutional ethnographies are, how they've developed, and how that then gets baked in to the sense of neutrality, right, and how we encounter institutions. Because all of these kind of situated selection processes get transferred into the technology systems and infrastructures on the front end. So we have like literally empirical data sets with tons and tons of information concentrated by institutions who have culture for no other reason than because it was stolen during conquest and really violent acts within the countries of origin. And so it can be really important to think about what these ethnographies are before everything is returned and to create archival data sets to be able to maintain that, while at the same time not erasing it because of what tech does when we try to correct it, right? We then are also seeing the ways in which digitization replicates a lot of the harms, informing us in how we talk and think about works online. So a museum might treat ancestral remains very different than a science museum. And I want to flag a couple of things here. One is the term human mummy. So I think in 2018, there was a shift in terminology about what it is that we're doing when we refer to people as mummies. And so this is meant to rehumanize the mummy and to make us realize like, oh yes, we're talking about a human here. But there's a lot of questions around, digitization and then also the use of copyright to potentially protect, okay? So to begin, this is catalog data or notes that would have been maintained on the back end that just get converted to digital form. But we're gonna have things like donated by, which are incredibly harmful, when we're talking about an ancestor. And this person, this woman, was actually found with 13 others in a cave when she was trying to escape Spaniards. And it's available, you know, at high resolution. There's a lot of conventions that aren't followed. She's what people would call unwrapped, you know, and you can see teeth, hair, fingernails, and all kinds of incredible details. We then have copyright trustees of the British Museum, right, imprinted over the image. Now, this is a propertization and a market-based right that gets claimed over these types of materials. And if you go to the British Museum's website, you'll see that actually their default approach is to apply a closed license. So this is attribution, do not use it for commercial purposes, you have to share it alike. But what they say is, we won't be sharing everything under the license due to cultural sensitivities, or if doing so would be against the existing museum policies, such as our human remains policy. And while we are seeing people treating collections, right, even to call this as a collection is violent, like thinking about these things a little bit more differently, it's still being designed for a very high level blanket approach in a way that doesn't actually remedy, but really exposes what the problem is in the first place, right? Maybe access, or digital access itself is the issue. But we also are seeing studies take what's been made available because it's easy, right? You don't have to go through all those permissions layers, try to get access to data, stuff that is right and ready, and perform new studies on it. So this was a paper on trustworthiness where these cognitive scientists argued that they had tracked historical changes in trustworthiness using machine learning analyses on facial cues and paintings. There were no art historians or artists included in the work. It was published in Nature, and they used an algorithm to generate trustworthiness evaluations. And they even tried to draw kind of conclusions and connections to the association between GDP and the rise of trustworthiness in Europe. I don't know how this got published, but it does relate to all of the work that we're seeing happening in tech and Black feminist circles around the harms of algorithm and even inclusivity, you know, bringing things into a system that's already violent in itself. And so what is, you know, incredibly interesting is that we're seeing things happen with collections as if it's a scientific way to prove something in and of itself, while not thinking about the fact that how the collection got to be there is it was curated, right? The digital reproduction was curated, the ways in which the artist represented the face, even flattered the person they were painting, without any critical attention. So this was supposed to have a thing so you could see the underlying page. One group that is doing phenomenal work around this question is called Whose Knowledge? And what they're doing is they're looking at how the global majority is being represented on the internet by a global minority, working with language, data structures, different types of engagement to both expose what's happening when we see knowledge represented as neutral, even on spaces like Wikimedia or Wikimedia Commons, where there's a lot of studies that even show the types of people who volunteer, who edit, right, are from certain socioeconomic stances, different parts of the world, largely English speaking, often male, and already working in tech. We see this materialize in biographies online. Less than 20% of Wikipedia biographies are about women. Things that are deemed to be not notable heavily weigh against women and people of color, right? So all of this is something that they're working to combat and also really think about in terms of public domain and open licensing. Like, how do we start to think differently about these things that have been seen as inherently good for so long? Because I mentioned this, but when you think that you have copyright in something, this is why I'm also relying a lot on art, and you think that you can commercialize it, you're gonna make decisions about digitization based on what the potential commercial value is. So even when we look at digital collections and all of the things that have been published as part of OpenGlib, there's gonna be a heavy bias in terms of specific creative expressions. Things that would have brought the institution money that now, because they've stopped that policy, they're just publishing openly. So very much two-dimensional Western paintings, largely represented by men, and different creative expressions not as featured. We then also have a lot of institutions now working directly with tech agencies to think about how they can help model technologies that do something, right? Because institutions are in and of themselves incredibly rich data sets and sources of knowledge that they can leverage for these partnerships. So Microsoft met at MIT, as well as this Next Rembrandt, where they built, and of course, a patented system of scanning all of Rembrandt's portraits, pulling it into some sort of machine learning algorithm that then predicted what the next Rembrandt would have been based off of everything there. But again, it's telling us stuff that we probably already know, rather than stuff that we really don't. And this is something that Nuria Rodriguez-Ortega writes about when she talks about hypercanonization, right? All these layers of how we've even set up our search engines, SEO, and the things that get reproduced, which have been informed themselves by all of these underlying values and biases in the post-digital realm. Another artist who's working and thinking about this critically is what's happening, especially with digital colonialism. So people trying to go to certain places to save at-risk heritage or at-risk archives or even endangered species in ways that extract the data and the information and then bring it back to be held by an organization who then protects it, right? And in some instances, we don't want to be publishing the migratory patterns of endangered birds, right? At the same time, who has access to that? Who's able to do the research around it? And what happens when it's published openly or under a license that doesn't allow that? Okay, so now that I've been batching open, I want to just use quickly a little example of citizen scientist research and the importance of having multiple open and interoperable systems to start to correct some of these biases. So Siobhan Leachman is total volunteer citizen scientist. She usually works with bioheritage library data, but what she's essentially doing is looking at the biases in the data structure, working with other open forms of structured data like Wikidata to figure out where there are specific gaps or changes. For example, where a woman who would have been Miss Andrea Wallace before she got married then becomes Mrs. husband's name and is eliminated from the record, right? While also recognizing the fact that quite often on our donor list, artist list, all of these sorts of things, we do need to maintain, you know, even the binary data that exists around gender as a way to be able to kind of create and trace some of this information. So she's been working with Wikidata to create structured data sets that also help patch and connect people that otherwise would have been erased, or, you know, their record would have ended because of these types of impacts that we see from wider societal issues. So this kind of brings us back to this kind of context of what context gets lost, whether it's an image as data or a data set as data, who decides what gets to be in that, why are they different? Because there's a lot of value in thinking even about the next text called technology and trend and how to repropertize. So if you can't see this, it says NFT collection. So what happened here was we had an artist work, Rifik Anadol. He made this data-driven artwork called Unsupervised, where he ingested the MoMA's entire digital collection of more than 200 years of art, created and minted digital abstractions for sale as NFTs. MoMA receives 17% of all primary sales and 55% of secondary sales from the series as it continues on. But we also know that while these things may look fun and cool, they have incredible impacts for people for whom they're not necessarily, you know, designed. So we know that studies are showing that NFTs and other computational heavy works are really using a crazy amount of energy, not just to run a small country, but it's not sustainable, right? So while we're seeing a lot of progress, where the data centers are typically located are in places that require a lot of water in order to cool them, and often where water is scarce because the companies who need to set these things up need governments who would permit that type of environmental destruction. We've seen it happen in Iowa, in Uruguay. So one of the questions I think that is kind of emerging from some of this is, where do we bridge the gap between these kind of digital and environmental ecosystems when we're thinking about openness and tech and how all of these things connect, and what it is we use it for. But we also have, of course, regulation through tech design. We need to see more tech regulation in forms of taxes, right? Different types of licensing, and ways in which we start to think differently about what it is that computers are doing compared to what it is that humans are doing and what we want to protect, right? Then there's a lot of frameworks that aren't necessarily legal that are coming into the mix and opening up spaces to bring Indigenous knowledge systems or anti-colonial knowledge systems into these questions in a really important way. Because, you know, part of what is happening is we're seeing this at, again, a very hyper level, only certain voices shaping what's happening at both policy and governmental levels, which really kind of goes back to this question of possession, right? And the power of possession, and where we start to see data and Indigenous sovereignty and digital restitution become really advocated in terms of returning possession back to the owners in all associated materials, data structures, research data, and rights in ways that grant possession and power to the owners themselves. And so a couple of really important kind of movements at the moment. We have local contexts, which looks at Indigenous knowledge, expressions, cultural and intellectual property, and developed a set of labels with North American Indigenous groups that can only be applied by the relevant community. But they relate to anything from environmental data, traditional knowledge, all the way to specific cultural expressions and the knowledge that's held within them. They have to be applied again in consultation with the community, and they map onto IP and ownership systems, but complement them in a way that gives Indigenous groups more power and greater agency about how their heritage is accessed or not, reused or not, and by whom. Another really interesting way that this is being integrated into tech is through the Makutu CMS system. And they've done this on a level where when you create a user profile, you signal specifically what group you associate with, maybe your level within that group if you're an elder, a specific gender, what you can and can't access within the community archive as well, right? So we're seeing tech start to kind of fill gaps. And this, of course, is an open source platform so that people can manage and share their own digital cultural heritage. At RAM, right down the street, we are working on digital and IP restitution, where we're basically performing an audit of things that have already been returned, from any even DNA sequencing or samples all the way to donor agreements, right? Letters that all should go back to the community so that they're able to have power over how the story is told or not, however they want it to be. So this is really where some of these anti-colonial IP and anti-colonial openness perspectives start to inform a better landscape for openness that is what we want it to be. And so there's a couple of things that we've written at policy levels because it's been moving so quickly, specifically to the Austrian government, where they were doing kind of a scope of what should we be doing with restitution. And there's been a lot of talk around, oh, we can digitize everything as part of restitution and that will help us restitute more. When it's like, oh no, because now you're creating all kinds of new property and intellectual property under those colonial systems where the stuff is held. So there's some qualitative questions that we can ask about what types of descriptions need to be on there, right? Or even how do we make changes when it relates to funerary, ancestral remains, and these sorts of more sensitive objects. But also because, as we know, digital and data can be important to undoing harms. It's about transparency, but it can also be harmful. So I really recommend, if you take one thing away from this talk, this paper by Lyra Monteiro. So the Penn Museum, which is in Philadelphia, in the 80s, there was a bombing of a Black liberation group. They were called MOVE, who had an entire community in Philadelphia, and the police attacked it wrongfully and killed 11 people in one house. some of those were children, and they still have the remains of two girls, 11 and 12-year-old. So she's been leading, and it's kind of related to the more cranial collection, because this is where the girls' remains ended up, this group called Fighting Ceremony, to really apply pressure to the institution, but also to talk about how open violence can exist just from making data in and of itself about some of these things. So what are we coming to? This is it, and I don't have any solutions. But we are seeing ways in which, instead of using AI to create these things that just tell us how biased it was in the first place, maybe instances of turning AI on itself to actually identify the bias, so that we can then figure out how to make data sets less harmful before publication. Also thinking about climate conscious policies for AI use and the publication of data. So we're seeing a lot of research that says you don't need huge data sets, you just need good ones, right? So like, what does that look like? But also using tech to close ethical gaps left by law, rather than using copyright as that blunt tool and rethinking digital access as part of that. While still, going forward with open to the greatest extent, but really normalizing closed access and reuse policies, even to the point where they're so limited that there's only specific people who are permitted within them. And then I think from our perspective, as researchers trying to anticipate these questions in our own work and even build them into the research proposal or as part of the work that we're doing and sharing all the results, right? The failures, the things that we've learned, very much within the kind of open movement mentality and framework, but so that other people can kind of build on them. So yeah, that's it. Thank you.